I just want to thank you all for being here tonight and excuse me, introduce our special guest tonight, Dr. Blake Henson. I'm going to be reading a little bit from my phone for a few minutes. I know some of you met him when he was with us 9 years ago, I guess it was. So here's a little bit of background on Blake. Hailed by the Choral Journal for his undeniable expertise as an experienced and successful choral conductor, pedagogue, and composer, Blake Henson has been praised for his music. The Gramophone magazine says moves from soothing sentiments to more exultant territory with exceptional harmonic vibrancy. It casts a spell that must be even more thrilling when heard in live performance, or as we can say, when even sung in live performance, when we get to sing it. And the New Jersey Star Ledger called his music powerful and thoughtful at the same time. A native Texan, Dr. Henson lives in Fort Worth, where he teaches music composition at Texas Wesleyan University. He holds bachelor's and master's degree in music theory and composition from Westminster Choir College, yay, in Princeton, New Jersey, as well as the degree Doctor of Musical Arts and Composition from The Ohio State University. TCS has been performing his music for about 12 years. I first came in contact with his music, his composition, My Flight for Heaven, and programmed it right away the next year. And also his beautiful setting of William Blake's Little Lamb. In 2011, TCS commissioned Dr. Henson to compose a work in celebration of our 35th anniversary season. August Moonrise was the result of that collaboration, and this exquisite piece has since been published and performed the world over. It is a pleasure and honor to have you with us here tonight, Blake. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here. And if you don't mind, before we get too far into this, I was wondering if you would indulge me for just a quick activity.
All of us or just me?
All of you, everyone in the room, everyone joining us today, if you'll give me just one quick minute. I just had a thought as you were reading that. So I'd like everyone to put your creative thinking hats on and imagine something for me. I'd like you to imagine that you have just invented a time machine. And for your first trip, you have all decided to go all the way back to an ancient year of 2015. So you're in 2015 and everything is so different. People are hugging, restaurants are full, parents are taking their children to the movie theater to see the Avengers and Star Wars. And now imagine that you run into the 2015 version of yourself. So you think, this is my chance. This is my chance to warn myself about what 2020 will be. So you tell your 2015 self all about what life is like in the year 2020. And I do mean all. Now imagine what 2015 you would feel like, or how you would react to that. As for 2015 Blake, I think that 2020 Blake I think that I would have lost my mind. I think at best, 2015 me would think, man, I really develop a strange sense of humor over the next 5 years, and I don't really get it. I say all of that as my means of an opening because I think the fact that you all who are here today have found a way to offer something honest and artistic with both one another and with your community during all of this is really nothing short of phenomenal. And I just want to start by recognizing that this thing that you're doing here today is absolutely extraordinary, and I thank you for it.
Well, thank you. So obviously you're sitting at home now.
Yes, I'm sitting here in my dining room.
What did you do today? What was your day like today?
So when I am not teaching composition at Texas Wesleyan, I am also an academic advisor at Texas Christian University just down the road. So I'm kind of doing double duty. And at TCU, we've just begun the academic advising season. It's time when students reach out to advisors to get help getting holds removed, figuring out classes for the next semester, trying to decipher what major might be right for them and what courses or programs they might want to consider. So today was back-to-back meetings with students who are just beginning that advising process. And at lunch, I got to run down to Texas Wesleyan, where I'm actually teaching lessons in person this semester. I have a large office. We wear a mask, so we stay physically distanced, and we take turns seeing who gets to be the person at the piano today. So I started advising at 8 o'clock. I went to teach a composition lesson at noon, and then I came back and advised until 5. And my wife was nice enough to have some dinner ready, so I scarfed down some chicken thighs, and now here I am, delighted to meet with all of you today.
That's great. So you teach college students composition. When did you first get the composition bug? I know when My Flight for Heaven, you wrote when you were in early 20s, it seems.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, but you started before then, I'm sure.
So when I was in, oh gosh, I want to say it was my freshman year of high school, but it might have been middle school. So I grew up singing in the Texas Boys Choir. And as part of rehearsal every day, we took a little break to do music theory. And at one point along the way, our conductor brought in an outside theorist from the local seminary to come teach music theory for that little sliver of time. And he happened to be a composer by the name of Michael Cox. And I just really got along well with Michael. So when his time teaching us had come to a conclusion, he invited me to come to the seminary after class each day to study composition with him privately. So that's what I did. And then around some point in high school, when Michael got busy and moved on to do other things, I started studying from a minister of music at a church up in Keller named, now I'm forgetting his name, John Parker. And if any of you know the name John Parker from your sacred music, he's written a lot of texts. So if you've done any Joe Martin music, for example, you've probably come across a John Parker text. So it really did start way back when I was about 13 or 14 years old. And my first published piece was this short, admittedly not very good kind of non-denominational Christian anthem that Shawnee Press published. An arrangement of the hymn, "Oh Jesus, I Have Promised." So it started all the way back then. Times have certainly changed since then, though.
So the first thing you said was, "Oh Jesus, I Have Promised." How do you select text?
Yeah. That's a good question. You know, when you're reading a book, how sometimes you can see in your head what you're reading, how you might read a story that's once upon a time, there lived a young girl who lived in a castle in a swamp. And you immediately picture that castle and that swamp. And as you read, you get more adjectives and more descriptions, and that image kind of gets clarified in your head. Music's a little bit like that for me. And I hesitate to admit that, but it's the truth. That I can pick up a text, and sometimes you just start to hear almost like a film score emerge over it. And the more of the text you read, the more it kind of gets clarified. So my first thing I look for when I'm looking for a new text is one where I can literally hear some music in my head. The other thing is, it's a sort of a system of practicalities. It's what kind of a piece do I intend to write? If it's commissioned and the ensemble is looking for a work that's only, say, 4 to 6 minutes long, then I know I can probably look for something in the vein of 20 to 24 lines. Beyond that, the work is just going to get too big, or the setting will be too wordy. So sometimes it starts very practically with how long of a piece am I looking for. The other one is, what's my audience? What's my ensemble like? Is this a high school choir? Is this an adult choir? Is this volunteers? Are they professionals? Because sometimes that feeds into what might be appropriate. And then on top of that, is this a work for a particular program? Does it need to fill a gap? Are you trying to tell a story? So you kind of put all of those things together. And then I like to look for texts in the public domain. In part because it saves all of the copyright battles of trying to get permission for work, but also because it's a neat opportunity to discover some works that others may have read at one point or a time, so that then when you do the setting, maybe there's somebody in the audience who says, I remember reading that at some point. And that's just kind of a neat thing you get to do as well. So some of it's practical, it really is. How long do I have? That equates into a number of stanzas or number of lines rather. And some of it's really just a matter of when I see something, can I hear the words themselves? Now, it gets more complicated when you start thinking that some text is inherently musical, while other text is really not. Without going too far off the deep end, I'll just say that there are some words that just don't sound good in our mouths. And then there are some that are just inherently very sweet, flowing, melodic or melodious, harmony, rich, deep, all of those things that describe the sounds themselves are just inherently musical. So if I can find a text that uses those, that's even better. And then the biggest one on top of that is I try to avoid setting a text that tells a story about which I have no personal experience. For the longest time, I avoided texts about death because quite honestly, I hadn't known anyone close to me who had died. And it just felt disingenuous to try to do a setting like that. So as my own life experiences have changed, so too have the texts that I've considered.
Do you keep a file of texts that you'd like to set someday, or?
I do. I keep a couple of files. I keep a file of texts that I love, but I don't have anything to do with right now. And I also keep a file of compositions I've started, but then I've realized, yeah, this isn't going the place that I thought it might go, or I'm not sure what I can do with this right now. And that goes into a file of drafts as well. I also keep a third file that I call victories. And my victories file is for those scores that I compose and I send to a friend, to a publisher, to an editor, and they write back and say, Blake, this is terrible. And then I say, all right, I have learned something about myself or about you or about your organization. So that's a victory for me. I've gotten something out of this. So that goes into my victory file. But yes, I do, to answer your question from now like an hour ago, absolutely. I keep a file full of text to consider.
What are your thoughts on composers who write their own texts?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful gift. It's just one that I don't have. If I felt like I could write words that are worthy of sharing, then I certainly would. But yeah, oration and that kind of writing is just not something that I am capable of doing. I will say that I've taught several students who do that, who maybe came to college as English writing majors, as playwrights, and then they become composers, and they always want to write their own text. And I think that's an amazing gift. Where it gets to be challenging, at least for them, is they have a hard time, oftentimes, separating the poet from the composer. Because as a composer, you often have to think sort of analytically about the poem and what the words themselves give you. And as a poet, you get the opportunity to interpret that and to reimagine that in ways that the composer may not be able to do. So it's a challenge to learn to fuse those two gifts together. So in a weird way, I'm actually kind of grateful that that's not a blessing that I have.
Okay. So you found the text and you say sometimes they start to speak to you right away.
Yeah.
So what's your compositional process then from that point on?
So the first answer to that is there's no one single process. It sort of depends on me, where I am, what I have accessible to me in terms of space and time to write, and the text itself. In an ideal world, though, I would take the poem and I would read it 36 times. And then I would, I'll actually back up and say, if I find it in a poetry anthology or on the internet or someplace like that, the first thing I do is type it into a regular old Word document, and I blow up the words and I leave big space between every line. And then I print like a dozen copies of it. First, I just leave them lying around everywhere. That way I can see the words no matter where I am in my house or in my office. But then as I read it over and over again, just trying to understand the work from the poet's perspective. And then once I think I've got an idea of what this poem is about, then I read it again to try to understand how I feel about it, how I fit into this big picture. And as I do, I make notes. So I'll write words to myself about words that I think are interesting, ideas I might have here, what this sounds like, and I'll actually write them between the margins, just as someone might edit their own document or something like that. Only after I've done that, only after I've spent time reading, considering, writing in notes, and getting to the point that I can read it over and over again and imagine the same music beginning to appear time and time again in my head, then do I sit down at a keyboard. And at that point, the first thing I try to imagine is the soundscape? What does this piece as a whole sound like? And I try to play that. And what I play may not actually end up in the score, but it gives me an idea of texture, of harmony, of tempo, of key even. Sometimes I'll get glimmers of melody, and sometimes I'll just get glimmers of how a particular sonority might be able to evolve. And once I think I found something that lines up with how I first imagined that poem when I first heard it in my head, that's when I start to write things down. From that point on, this is going to sound awfully clinical, but it's almost an exercise in form. You know, every poem's got to have a beginning and a middle and an end. And so I'll work through each of those. I may write the opening, what I call an opening gesture, the opening 2 to 4 to 6 bars that sets the scene to say, this is what this world, this universe that we're about to live in sounds like. And then I might write the first few bars of a melody if there is one. Then I actually like to skip and imagine what that climax will be like again, if there is one. Where is this going? So I'm starting here. I really want to know, what's my end game? What am I heading toward? So I'll write that next. After that, everything sort of falls into place, because if I know I start here and I know I'm heading here, well, then I just have to imagine what the ending is like, and I pass the beginning through the middle by means of the end, and the ending is kind of there. So it kind of puts itself together. And after that, it's just a matter of filling in the gaps, you know, looking for color, looking for contrast, looking for opportunities in the words, and it kind of puts itself together. I know that sounds easier said than done, but really, once you've kind of developed a sound, it's a little bit like, I know very little about theater, but I imagine it's a little bit like once a set designer has created a stage, created the scenery, then you can almost sort of imagine the potential for dialogue and for conversations and for conflict to appear. So once I've kind of created that musical scenery, you know, then it's just a matter of telling the story, remembering about the beginning and the middle and the end.
I see some of you are putting questions in the chat, and we'll do those at the there'll be time for that later. So do hold on to any questions you might have. How is composing for voices? What are considerations when composing for voices? I mean, other than range and tessituras.
Well, so the most obvious one is voices encounter text. We have words we have to grapple with. That is, we have a literal story to tell. So, you know, the first part is, I mentioned that I won't set a poem or I won't set a text if it's not something with which I'm personally familiar. So if I can't tell an honest story, but I also try to keep in mind the performers as well, and try not to create a story that another performer might not be able to kind of dig into and share themselves. So that's part of it. You know, the other part is every singer is just so different. This is not to say that 2 clarinets can't be different or aren't different, but you know, 2 sopranos might be just wildly different from one another. So there's so much fun stuff to keep in mind, and it helps to know who you're writing for. For the longest time, anytime I wrote anything, I had sort of a makeshift choir in my head. I won't tell you who that was, but I had this sort of hypothetical became real ensemble. I just imagined them singing everything over and over again. And I realized after a while, the problem was I was always writing for that particular choir. And there are a million different choirs with more than that individual singers to keep in mind. So I had to kind of dial that down a little bit and imagine this absolutely hypothetical ensemble that didn't exist anywhere to make more sense out of that. But the biggest obstacle really is that singers have text, and singers need to breathe. That our art form begins not with that first note, but with the breath that comes before it. And if you think about the breath leading into something as really being the onus or the onset for a musical work, that's something that so many other genres really don't have to grapple with, at least the same way. So we have text, we have breath. And lastly, at least in a choral situation, you know, we're all together either in spirit as we might be right now, or personally, physically together someday. And so when you're performing together, you're also breathing together. And you've probably heard 1,000 times, I think I've said 1,000 times, that a choir that breathes together sings together. And I think that's absolutely true when you're composing something as well, is how can the work breathe so that the singers can do what they do. There's a lot to it, yeah.
How is it when you compose a piece where the text has already been set, and I'm thinking of Little Lamb,
Okay.
and everyone is it Taverner?
Yeah,
What is
Taverner,
yeah,
sure. Mhm.
yeah. And everyone knows that one so well. How is it that you don't hear that in your head and you're coming up with your own wonderful setting of that? Is that a challenge
Yeah,
or?
it's a good question. You do it first. I could tell you that as soon as I've decided I'm going to set a Little Lamb, I just try not to listen to any other settings of that. And that might be true, but you've heard it already and it's happening in your head or in your subconscious. It's kind of gurgling underneath there. But the truth is, I think as long as one approaches the text the same way of reading over and over again to understand what William Blake in this case might have been saying, and then try to imagine Blake's story before putting, well, this is confusing because I'm Blake too, imagining William Blake's story before trying to imagine Blake Henson's story, I think it's impossible to then compose something that sounds like Taverner. Although, if we have time, I do have a funny story about my intentionally ripping off another composer for 2 bars, but I'll hold on to that for a few minutes. But so yeah, it's all about how you approach the text initially. At least I think, and trying to make sure you approach it honestly. And then in that case, you can listen to a Taverner setting and maybe even think, wow, that was really good. I'll take that idea and use it later. But if you've approached the text as a William Blake poem first, then I think it's difficult to compose something in the style of what someone else has done. And by the way, I have friends who are composers, and we often, well, I won't say often, but from time to time, we will kind of gravitate toward the same texts. And by approaching it that way, by each of us having our own compositional process, it's really fun to say, let me see your work when you're done, and I'll share mine with you, because we never come up with the same things. And I don't think we ever say, oh, I'm going to use that in my work, because it wouldn't be honest for the work that you've already written. So, things like that happen a lot, and it's more fun than it is treacherous.
Do you think you have an advantage over other composers who aren't singers?
I don't know that it's an advantage or a disadvantage. I would just say I like to think that I compose vocal music with the singer in mind. So I hope I write something that's easy to sing. And I hope I write things that fit the voice well. I won't always say it's easy to sing, but I hope I at least write things that fall into the voice relatively well. But if that makes it better or worse, I don't know if that's an advantage or not. On the other hand, that could be a bad thing, because I'm too afraid to write something that's too difficult to perform. Maybe I'm holding myself back. So I'd say it's a quality, it's an attribute of my writing style, but I don't know if it's an advantage or a disadvantage.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to start moving a little bit to August Moonrise. And
sure.
What was it about Sara Teasdale's poem that drew you?
So I actually kind of have a longer story answer to that, if you got a few minutes.
I think we? Yeah, we're good.
So it's such a simple question that I'm sure has a 1 or 2 sentence response. And now I'm going to give you like 5 or 6 paragraphs on it. To answer where August Moonrise came from and really how I chose that text and why I gravitated toward it, we have to go back in time to 2015. No, we have to go back to before My Flight for Heaven even existed. So when I was in college, I sang with an ensemble that specialized in music of the Renaissance, Baroque, and living composers. Something at the time that made a lot of sense to me. And looking back, I think, what a weird group that was. But as part of one of the concerts, the conductor decided that he was going to do as many settings of the Song of Solomon text, Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away, as possible. So he knew of 4 or 5 versions. I think he just scoured the internet for more. He asked his composer friends to write some, and he said, hey, Blake, you're at the time studying composition. Would you like to write one as well? And I thought, yeah, this sounds great. And I approached that one just as I think a college composition student does, which is to look at the text and say, all right, it's about kind of 2 things, rising up and the transformation from winter into spring. So warmth out of cold. So as long as I keep things going up and warmth coming out of cold in mind, it's going to be great. So that's what I did. I tried to set a work that did those 2 things. And by the way, I actually kind of like that work still. I think younger me did a pretty good job there, but that's neither here nor there. So the group performs the piece, and I'm proud of it. And after it's over, a gentleman kind of comes up to me in the audience. Back then, we had audiences of like 12 to 15 people. So it wasn't uncommon for the person to recognize the composer afterwards. So man comes up to me and he has this scowl on his face and he's really upset. And he says that he'd like to talk to me about writing a work for his church, that he works at this church in Manhattan. He'd like me to write a work for him. And he says that he came to our concert. He was intrigued by our concert because he's thinking about doing the same thing, but Good Friday with the Ovos Omnis text and do lots of settings of the Ovos Omnis all at once. And would I be willing to write one of those? So I thought about it and thought, well, this could be interesting. Tell me a little more. And I'm hoping he'll tell me about his church, his program, about anything. And instead he says, well, we can't pay you much. Only have about $50 for this commission. I thought, well, okay, I'm a college student. $50 is pizza and beer. That sounds pretty good to me. But okay. And he says, well, the reason is we've already set aside all of this money for a big ad in the New York Times. So to make this worth your while, we'll give you the $50, which wouldn't even cover the train ride to Manhattan and back. But we'll give you the $50. But then we'll redo the ad. So it says in big block letters, featuring world premiere by internationally acclaimed composer Blake Henson. And that made me chuckle because at the time, only about 24 people in the world knew my music and they were all in central New Jersey. So internationally acclaimed was a stretch. But anyway, something about all of this just intrigued me. And I thought, all right, I'm going to do it. I'm kind of getting some ideas of what I might do with this. And he says, good, still hasn't smiled. Good. Just don't make it sound like the Casals. Wow, that's an interesting request. Why would it sound like another composer's work? Getting back to your question from earlier, Jim. He just says, we do the Casals every year and I'm tired of it. I want it to not sound like the Casals. All right, that's the strangest. We're not going to pay you much. We're going to, it's for the exposure kind of thing, but don't make it like this other composer wrote it in the early 20th century. All right. So he left, never smiled, handed me his business card and says, we'll be in touch, and just kind of takes off. And I turned around and another member of the choir is standing there. He's overheard this whole conversation. And he says, so what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'll tell you exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to start by quoting the damn Casals. And that's what I did. So I sat down, really kind of tongue in cheek, sat down with the Pablo Casals setting of Ovos Omnis. And I took the first 2 to 4 bars and I said, all right, I'm going to kind of rework those first 2 to 4 bars. And I'm just going to start with an in your face, hey, remember this? This is that piece you love so much. I was a very different person back then. Anyhow, so I do the first couple measures. And then after that, it's a question of, all right, I've done my humor. I've done my joke. What can I do with this that's mine? So the rest of the work kind of evolved, and none of anything that followed sounded anything remotely like the Casals. If I remember when the piece was premiered, he liked it and came to me and said, the opening sounded too much like Casals. I just thought, well, that's good. I did a good job. But I tell you all of that, you're wondering how this is going to get to August Moonrise, and I promise I'm getting there. But after the Arise My Love and the Casals, there we go. After the August Moonrise and the Ovos Omnis, somehow GIA got a hold of both of those, and they really liked them and wanted to publish them, which I was grateful for. And then a year or two later, My Flight for Heaven came about, and it just so happened that My Flight for Heaven was commissioned to be the first work of a choral series that was going to be published by GIA. So when they saw that, they were just over the moon, and they could kind of see, I think they thought they could see my trajectory a little bit. It was Arise My Love, the Ovos Omnis, My Flight for Heaven, and they just thought this was phenomenal. So they offered me what kind of worked out as kind of an informal lifetime contract. And the deal was anything you write, they wanted to see it and get a chance to review it before saying no or passing it off to somebody else. And I thought that was amazing. So young me, I can do whatever I want now. The wheels are off, the training wheels are off, no holds barred. I have carte blanche to say whatever I want to say. And I was so excited. So I spent the next several years after My Flight for Heaven just really going in every different direction. I did an Emily Dickinson setting about a woman who is literally going insane. That then I shared with them and they said, yeah, this is a little dark for us, Blake. Okay, victory, okay. And then I wrote a polar opposite end of that. I wrote a piece that was almost entirely in root position triads, trying to be really clean and simple. I found beauty in the C major chord. And they said, yeah, this is a little too simple, Blake. But okay, victory. So put that aside. And then it was just one thing after another. There's a work that was in Spanish. There was a women's choir work. There's another piece that was written by a poet who's since deceased, but before she died, she translated her own text into English, and a really broken English that doesn't make a lot of sense, but I found beautiful. So I set that, and they said, no, we don't really follow this. It was just kind of one victory after another. And as this is all happening, and it's just, there's this gap growing of time that's passed since I've written a work. Sorry, my cat is meowing in the background here. He's found a toy. Good job. Thank you for bringing it to me. That was unexpected. So as this gap is growing between My Flight for Heaven being published and kind of nothing else growing, I'm writing all of this music, but I'm getting frustrated. And it came to a point that I was sort of sharing this whole story with a couple of my composer friends, and they just kind of smiled and nodded and said, yeah, it really stinks when you realize your time has passed you by. And ooh, that hurt. That just really, that got me. I think, is it real that I was in college, I wrote or grad school, I wrote My Flight for Heaven, and after that, I'm just done? I have nothing else to say? Yeah, that's ridiculous. And things changed a little bit when I met a conductor at Lawrence University named Phillip Swann. If you ever bump into Phillip Swann out in the world, give him a pat on the back for me. I had just moved to Wisconsin, and Phillip asked me to come down and work with the Lawrence Conservatory Chamber Choir. They're doing a piece of mine. And I drove through a blizzard to get there. And when I get there, the strangest thing happens. He greets me at the door, and from that moment pretends like he has known me for decades. And you might think, well, that's really sweet. He's kind of going out of his way to make you feel at home. Now, this is a little creepy almost, because it wasn't just pretending like we know each other for a long time, but he's referencing works that I don't think anybody else has ever seen and telling these stories that I don't think I shared with anyone. So I'm just kind of smiling and nodding and thinking, oh, I'll figure this out one of these days. Anyway, after rehearsal's over and the blizzard has come through, so I'm just kind of stuck there at Lawrence for a while. He and I get to chatting, and I find out that he has somehow found scores to all of these works over the years that nobody ever published. I still don't know where those came from. And he's so excited I'm there because he wants to talk to me about each and every one of them. And thinking, good, because nobody else wants to talk about these, so this will be interesting. So there in a blizzard, we're kind of going through them one at a time. And I can feel myself getting sad that it's score after score of music that no one has ever heard and likely ever will hear. And finally he says, well, you know why nobody's performing any of these, right? So, no. He says, well, because none of them sound like you. And that surprised me. And I thought, well, of course they sound like me. And I started trying to like make a defense of that, of why each one of them is uniquely Blake Henson. But the more I tried and the more I looked at the scores, the more I realized he was right, that indeed, none of them really were me. I worked so hard to be creative and think outside of the box. I kind of forgot who I was. And that was very sad. Because then comes the question of, well, now how do you rediscover yourself? And I didn't have an answer for that either. So I spent some time away from writing, a couple of months. I just stopped and stepped back, and I focused on being a good teacher. I was writing a book at the time, so I worked on the book, but I sort of stopped composing for a bit. And then, of course, somewhere in there, I got the bug to start visiting poems again. And so I'm always looking for poems, as I kind of mentioned earlier, to put in that drawer of things to set later. And I came across the Sara Teasdale Flame and Shadow, a collection of multiple poems. And I was going through them, and I came across August Moonrise. And it really struck me that the first time I read it, I felt deeply nostalgic, which is odd, because when you think about it, it's really just a poem about a woman in this, or a person in this moment, who is describing the scenery and sees this kind of beautiful moon and realizing that, you know, my life is kind of complete now that I've seen this thing. There's really nothing about it that's that nostalgic. But for me, reading that, I just felt I couldn't stop thinking about my childhood. I couldn't stop thinking about camping trips with my parents, or being out at the lake house with my grandmother, or just over and over. Every time I read that poem, I just thought about kind of little kid Blake, and I couldn't shake it. Even though that's really not, at the time, I didn't think that's what the poem was about. I really just couldn't let go of it. And it was while, and I did eventually just sort of put in a stack of things to consider later, but that really kind of did something in me, because from that moment on, I found myself just deeply nostalgic constantly. And And looking back over my life, which at the time I was all of what, 29 years old. So that sounds very dramatic. And looking back on my 29 years, but I found myself looking back and not being sad, but just kind of surveying how things came to be and taking stock of where I was in that moment. And so I was in the midst of that sort of series of introspection, of self-reflection. And that's when you sent me an email, Jim. And you reached out and said, hey, Blake, I'd like to commission a work from you for the Thomas Circle Singers 35th anniversary. And we got to talking back and forth. And you said something that I'll never forget. You said, you can compose whatever you want, just tell us what you need. And that is not something to this day another conductor has ever said. There's always a program, there's always a theme, there's always something to keep in mind, there's always, but we don't have any tenors this year, or but you should know we've got this really deep alto and I love to have a contralto solo. Or there's always just something happening, but you didn't say any of that. You just said, you can write whatever you want, just let us know what you need. And I knew I had to set August Moonrise. And I grappled with it a little bit because I would have loved to have written something celebratory. It's this big anniversary. I want to celebrate you, celebrate the singers, celebrate music. But I just couldn't let go of this particular text. And I mention all of that because I'd actually like to finish this by going back to something that I said to you all the last time I was there, however many years ago. At least that was 9 years ago. Is that how long ago that was?
Yep.
Seems like just last week. But while I was there, I sort of made a joke about asking if you noticed a little My Flight for Heaven nod to it. And you all kind of nodded your head, and I chuckled. I think I even said something like, yeah, I just threw that in there or something, but I passed it off. And I want to come back to that because that wasn't entirely honest. I wrote that work largely start to finish, where I usually do beginning, middle, and end. This really was right the opening with the piano, trying to imagine the scene. And then the cello comes in to provide a little extra color. And then out of that rises the voices. And I really did write one measure after another. And I wasn't thinking too much about the form or the technique or anything about that. But I got to a point that I kind of paused and I went back to play through at the piano what I'd done. And when my fingers found that I'd done that My Flight for Heaven quote, I hadn't intended that at all. In fact, it sort of happened. And the fact that came out of this desire to find myself, this desire to look back on who I am and rediscover what I sound like, the fact that just happened so naturally, it actually made me cry sitting at the keyboard because I realized in that moment that I had found my way home. And that's how August Moonrise came to be.
Wow, thanks for sharing all of that. That's really very moving and meaningful to hear all of that. And as you're saying that, I'm flipping in the score to the section that is the quote from My Flight for Heaven.
But when have I been sure of now?
Yes, exactly.
Yep.
I remember the first night the singers just sang through it. We ended a rehearsal with it. I said, we just got this. We got to sing through it once. And that was the end of the rehearsal. And I can clearly picture one of the sopranos coming up to me at the very end and saying, this is why we sing.
Oh.
Sing music like this. This is why we sing. I'm just keeping an eye on time a little bit. And
Sure.
I know some singers have thrown some questions into the chat mix. And I've lost my chat. Here it is. Okay. Do you ever want to go back and revisit a piece you wrote several years ago?
All the time. And I always think that I'll be able to go back and revisit those works with 20/20 ears. But the truth is, every time I go back to even those things I wrote back when I was in high school, I kind of slip back into where I was at the time that I wrote those pieces. So what happens is I ended up not editing anything, but just adding to them. So I kind of find myself back in the vein and the ear and the mindset of the work whenever I wrote it. And then I just sort of add who I am now, and it just gets more and more messy. I would love to be able to go back and clean up some of those. The Emily Dickinson one that I mentioned, that's so incredibly dense. I would love to be able to go back and clean that out a little bit. Similarly, the work that was by the woman who translated her own text into English, and the English words didn't make sense, and I found beauty in that. I'd love to just start that all over again. But the truth is, every time I try, it ends up just sounding like that work plus 20 years stuck on top. So I'm not very good at that, is I think the answer to your question.
Another question is, do you hear the music in your head? Do you sit down at the piano? I know you said sometimes you're reading something and the melody starts to come to you, so yeah. I know probably a combination, but if you'd like to talk about that.
Yeah, indeed, it is really sort of a combination of things. And like I said, it sort of depends on what the text, how the text speaks to me. More often than not, I hear the landscape first, which again, may or may not be harmonies used in the work. It may or may not be the key or the tempo, but at least gives me an initial starting off point for what the soundscape of the particular work sounds like. And then after that, sometimes I'll hear little melodies. Sometimes it's just a matter of almost theoretically manipulating through motivic transformations, if you will, an idea of, okay, well, I have these 3 notes in my head, but I can do this with that and this and this and that. And hopefully somewhere along the way, I hit one, I think, oh, that one's pretty good. Maybe I'll use this here. So, and then you combine those 3 little notes as part of that motivic transformational process to that soundscape I created initially and think, well, okay, now I need to adjust the soundscape to account for this transformation. And it works back and forth. So sometimes it's a little more technical like that, but sometimes it really is, as you say, just a matter of, I have an idea for a broad sound. Let me sit at the piano and play that sound and then hear what just emerges in my mind or what the text does with that. So yeah, it kind of depends on the work, but not to be a broken record on this, but it usually, the one common theme, I think, is that it all starts with that kind of general, these are the sounds, this is my palette, these are the sounds I'm going to use in this work based off of whatever the text says to me.
An unrelated question, but somewhat related. This is my own thrown in. Does it work in reverse? Do you sometimes get a melody or music in your head and say, I need to find a text to go with that? I.e. Whitaker.
I won't mention any composers, but the other composers. That's interesting. So I invented this thing while I was in college, an invention that didn't take off, and I'm still very sad about that. And it's called shower manuscript. I'm not making this up. So those those little plastic report covers you used when you were in school, where you put like the cover of your report in it and you 3-ring binder it. I got a bunch of those. I just picked up boxes of them and I printed off manuscript paper, and I put the manuscript paper inside the report cover and I duct taped all around it, because duct tape is great at keeping water out of things. And then I would just tape it up inside the shower behind the shower head where the water doesn't splash a whole lot. And then I clipped a wet erase marker or a vis-a-vis to it, because I found that every time I'm in the shower, something pops into my mind. And there's a psychological reason for that, your unconscious self being able to communicate with your consciousness, but that's for another chat. But every time I'm in the shower, something pops up. And it's really helpful to be able to just write it down really quickly. And I'll tell you, there have been a number, and again, I'm not making this up, a number of times where I have almost severely injured myself by leaping out of the shower, still soaking wet, running through the house, trying to find some manuscript paper to write something down before I forget about it. So shower manuscript, I think, was brilliant. I thought that was really great. And then when you write it down and you realize, you know what, this is a terrible idea. There's so much satisfaction in just getting your hand wet in the shower and rubbing it off really quickly to say, nope, I didn't do that. That never took off. I really wanted that to be an invention, but that never took off. So it happens. It happens at the most inopportune times, while you're driving to work, while you're out for a run, while you're biking, while you're in the shower. You might think of an idea, but then maybe my question to myself would be, has a musical work ever come of one of those ideas? And the honest to God truth is, I don't know. I really don't. I think of thoughts, I write them down. Sometimes they go into journals. What would be fun to do is to go back and look. I have these little moleskin composition journals that I write what I think are the good ideas in. It'd be fun to go back through those journals and see if any piece I've written is in there somewhere. Because I don't know if there is. So it's a good question. I honestly don't know the answer to that, though. I'd say it's not a conscious thing if it does happen.
I want to do 2 more questions from singers, and then move on. You hear stories in popular music about how writers get the burst of an idea, and boom, an hour later they have a new hit song written. Do you buy that, or is that totally BS?
Yeah, I buy that. I did that once. A little piece called My Flight for Heaven. It was written in one session, start to finish, sitting at one keyboard without breaks for coffee or water or restroom or anything. But the whole thing done start to finish. And I'm very proud that that has not been edited. When the work was done, I sent it to the ensemble the next morning. And I went back several times and thought about, well, maybe this note should go there, this should happen here, I should move the text around. But I just decided, no, that was the most perfect writing session I'm ever going to have. So when GIA picked it up, that was actually the deal, was we're not touching this. We're going to leave this untweaked. And I think it helped that the Arise My Love and the Ovo Somedays had kind of been really popular. So they were willing to take a shot at that. So yeah, I believe that, because it wasn't 1 hour, it was about 6 or 7 hours, but it was one start to finish writing session. So yeah, that happens.
Well, I think with pop music, they can do it in an hour because they only have to deal with 3 chords. So it goes a lot quicker than
If you get a chance, the Axis of Awesome is really great. Get on YouTube, look up Axis of Awesome 4 chords, invest 20 minutes of your time into this music video of a band that's playing all the songs they can think of that use the same 4 chords. It is amazing. Axis of Awesome, it will change your life. Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
One last question. So the inverse of that is, do you have a disciplined process, like sitting every day at a set time, or otherwise to create structure to compose?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I did once upon a time. Gosh, I don't remember when I stopped doing it, but for a long time I did. I'd have regular hour-long writing sessions. And by the way, I know some composers who still do that very, very well. But they will, it's kind of a la Johannes Brahms. They will write in the morning, they'll do one kind of work in the morning, one kind of work in the afternoon, and in the evening a different one. And they always have 3 works going, or they're moving in from one time of day from another. I tried that for a while, and I don't know if it was successful or not, but just eventually life gets in your way. There's this meeting you have to go to, or a concert you want to attend, or someone's a friend from out of town, and eventually you come into a time when you're writing whenever you've got a spare moment or two. So yeah, I did that for a while. I think I'm just not as disciplined in my life to be able to keep that going. But that's a great question. If anyone ever encounters the composer Benjamin Williams, Ben is one of those who writes steadfastly at particular times every day. And again, I think that's just amazing that someone can do that.
Writing that name down.
I don't know if he's written any choral music, but
and Axis of Awesome.
Axis of Awesome will change your life. I'm telling you. They even made a sequel. It was so popular, more music got written after they did the original Axis of Awesome. So they had to go back and do another one. Will change your life.
Before we turn to August Moonrise, do you have any current projects you're working on?
I do. So right when COVID hit, I had just started this project where I was trying to do low-cost commissions for ensembles that might not normally be able to afford to commission a composer. And I had 3 high schools lined up, 3 groups that really didn't have big artistic budgets. So we played we'll work with whatever you've got game. And I was so excited to get started on all 3 of those. But then when COVID hit, there were so many questions that came up. And even when those questions maybe started to get resolved, no one has budgets at all for things like new music anymore. So those have all kind of gotten put on hold. And the great thing about that, if great is too strong a word, but the interesting thing about that is, well, while I may not be able to write these commissions for other works, it does give me a chance, other ensembles, it does give me a chance to write those things that I've always wanted to write, but never had time for. And that gets to the big one. Several years ago, I got into song cycle and I started writing songs. And I wrote 2 song cycles, both of which I think are particularly good. And one of them is a cycle called Dirge for Two Veterans that uses a text from Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Mm-hmm. And I put it together so that it aligns with the cycle of grief, so that each movement is a different stage in the grieving process. And it's one of those works that I wrote, and to this day, I'm convinced it's the best thing I've ever composed, but there's not a big market for song cycle. And the more when I get bored, I will sit at home and just play through that at the piano because I really like that work. And it occurred to me a couple of weeks ago, this would sound amazing with a choir. So that's the project that I'm getting started on now. Is I'm taking the Sturds for Two Veterans multi-movement work, and I'm going to turn it from a song cycle into being a multi-movement choral work. And my plan is when I'm done with that to then orchestrate it after that.
Awesome. That's
Yeah.
great. So I guess you've experienced grief then in your life.
Yeah, haven't we all in different ways, both literally and metaphorically. And I just think over the last several years, it would be naive to say that we haven't experienced a new style of grief, I think. So certainly I've had loved ones close to me who have died, but I've also I think we've all kind of gone through something recently. And, I think we're all grieving a lot.
What we're doing in our Zoom rehearsals is, we can't sing at the same time on Zoom yet. So what we've been doing is every singer has their score and they're on mute, and we sing along to, so we're holding them up to show you. Some are, we sing along to recordings. And the recording we have, Aaron, our administrative director, is going to play our video of our performance of this in May of 2019. We've done this work twice since the premiere because we really view this is TCS's piece, and we love to share it with people. So this is our performance from a year ago, last May.
Okay. Thank you for sharing this with me.
Yeah, and we're going to we're all going to be on mute, and we're going to listen and sing along. So, Aaron, when you're ready. Thank you for that, Blake.
Thank you. That was all you. Thank you all so much.
TCS, it was fun being with you again tonight. To our guests this evening, thanks for joining us. It was wonderful having you with us as well. And again, Blake, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really got a lot. We got some comments coming in now. You can see the chat. Yeah, the flowers and roses are being thrown your way down here.
Well, really, the pleasure and the privilege is all mine. So thank you all so much for being so gracious and willing to have me into your homes today. It means a lot.
Thank you.